Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Hi, this is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. This past week, Traveler provided an update on the status of the Coneil Bay Resort at Virgin Islands National Park, and it wasn't encouraging for those hoping to stay at the resort anytime soon. We also brought you news of an effort to reinstate the access ban on e-bikes in the national parks, detailed the effort by the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation to raise $300,000 to fund much-needed improvements on the parkway, and offered some ideas on where to get your fix of cold and snow in the national park system in the coming months. You can find those and other stories about national parks and protected areas at nationalparkstraveler.org. This week, we spend some time with Kyle Joly, a National Park Service wildlife biologist, discussing his research into which terrestrial species makes the longest annual migration in the world. Contributing writer Kim OConnell, fresh back from a visit to New Orleans, gives us a preview of her time at Jean LaFitte National Historical Park and Preserve. Most, if not all of us, are aware that various animal species migrate. At The Traveler, we've written about seasonal bird migrations and the hawk watch programs in various national parks that try to count the raptors that pass through seasonally. And those familiar with Yellowstone National Park no doubt have heard at least a little something of the migrations of bison in and out of the park. But what other species migrate, and how long are those migrations? Kyle Joly, a wildlife biologist with the National Park Service who has spent a couple decades in places such as Gates of the Arctic, Noatak, Kobuk Valley, and other National Park System units in northern Alaska, recently published a paper in Nature on that topic and is here today to discuss his findings with us. Welcome to The Traveler, Kyle.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, so very basic question right off the top. Why do animals migrate?
There's a lot of different reasons to migrate. One of the classic reasons is to get food. And so in a lot of places that have high seasonality, where you have short, brief summers and long, cold winters, animals will migrate to those areas where there's a lot of high vegetative productivity in the summertime. You'll see that with birds. You also see it with caribou.
And I'm guessing that human development somehow is impacting those migrations. Are animals having to move further, or are they limited in the distances they can travel because of our activities or our development?
Yeah, it can work either way. And so human development can impact migrations. In a lot of cases, the development will curtail or shorten migrations. The infrastructure will act as some kind of barrier to movement, and that will constrict the spaces that are available. But there are examples where infrastructure has been put in, and the animals will have to go around or find a different spot where they can cross, and that will actually lengthen migration. So it depends on the type of development and where it's placed in the migratory path.
It must be having an adverse impact on some species, no? I mean, we've long heard about national parks being turned into biological islands because of development surrounding the parks.
Yeah, I would say that while it can go either way, the vast majority of the impacts are negative, and they lead to shortened migration paths or the extinguishment of migrations altogether.
And so how does that affect the biology of these species?
In some cases, it can be rather dramatic. Places where migrations have been extinguished, populations have been greatly reduced. In some places, impacts are smaller. The animals are just delayed for a few days crossing a road, for example, and we haven't seen huge biological impacts, but in general, the effects are rather large. They're pervasive. They're global in scale. Migrations have been impacted and imperiled globally right now.
I would imagine that's not a good thing.
No, it isn't. If you care about diversity in wildlife, and if you don't, you should, because all of the planet is interconnected, and we rely upon the services that these wildlife and wild ecosystems provide to humans.
And along with possibly limiting their migration, I guess some of these developments also, animals are habituating to them and not feeling as threatened as they might have been once upon a time. Is that good or bad?
Well, I guess I would take a step back and question that premise. There's a new paper out looking at the oil field developments in northern Alaska, the Prudhoe Bay area. And so those developments have been around for 40 plus years, and caribou are still avoiding those areas where the oil and gas development is strongest. And so I think, whether or not animals habituate is still kind of an open question, and in places it looks like they don't.
No, that kind of surprises me, just because some of the photos I've seen with, wildlife around some of those oil pipelines. And, here in Utah, I mean, obviously we don't have large migrational corridors, at least not that I'm aware of, but moose have habituated with our subdivision and come through. And so I was just wondering if some of those larger developments might adversely impact the wildlife, but it doesn't sound like they're really having that great of an impact.
I guess I wouldn't say that. There's places where you will find animals living in developed areas, in places where there's a lot of infrastructure. There tend to be certain species that like mixed environments. They liked what we call early seral stages. So when succession has been reset, as humans like to do, they will chop down forests and there'll be new growth. So certain animals like that. Like you said, moose, they like early successional habitats, and so they're attracted to that. Another thing is that humans aren't very tolerant of predators, and so close into human development, there tends to be less predators, and prey species figure that out, and they tend to gravitate towards those areas. One classic example is in Jasper National Park in Canada, which is right next to Banff. The elk at night tend to move into town.
Mm-hmm.
People think that's because the wolves are afraid to go into town, and so there's lower predation risk closer to town, and so the prey species will take advantage of that.
Interesting. Going back to the 1990s, there's been an effort called the Yellowstone to Yukon effort to basically, I guess, secure a migrational corridor from Yellowstone National Park north to the Yukon. Has that been successful?
My parks are at the very northern edge of that. The ones that I work in, like Gates of the Arctic, is in the Brooks Range, the Central Brooks Range, and the Brooks Range is the northern extension of the Rocky Mountains. My understanding of the initiative is that it's a very worthy cause, but it hasn't had dramatic success at this point. Another thing is that you have to look at migrational routes. A lot of animals don't migrate north-south along the spine of the continent, along the Rockies. A lot of them will utilize the higher elevations at one season and then drop down during another season, and so the migration doesn't kind of run north-south. It'll kind of run up elevation and down elevation, or east and west, depending on the flow of the mountains. But one thing, that is very admirable about the project is that it's looking for habitat connectivity. And that's one of the major influences on loss of biodiversity and loss of migrations is loss of large intact ecosystems.
Yeah. Are you aware of any other similar projects to try and make that connectivity over such a large distance? I mean, with again, development around parks, creating biological islands, or even with climate change and the need for flora and fauna to migrate, are we seeing more attention being placed on that connectivity?
Oh, certainly we've seen more attention. I think the Yukon to Yellowstone initiative has kind of taken it to the next level. It's a much bigger scale project. I think we've seen it at smaller scales, and you can look at it at the very fine scale. We've put in underpasses and overpasses for a variety of wildlife species to connect habitats so they don't get run over as they're crossing highways and things like that. And so, it's just a matter of scale, but the same goal of connecting those habitats so wildlife can roam freely.
Yeah, and I guess one of those efforts is being propelled by the Wildlands Network. I know in the East Coast, they've been working to try and create that connectivity through the Appalachian Range down south, and I think they've got some other locations in the country as well. Are you familiar with their efforts?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the project. I don't get to the East Coast very much. Most of my work's focused up in Alaska, in northern Alaska. But yeah, I'm familiar with that organization, and that is definitely one of their goals, is to try and rewild places that have been affected by human development and try and connect those wild spaces so animals have a place to go. And that's especially true in a changing climate. That connectivity will be important for animals to adapt to the changing climate.
Yeah. And of course, here in the continental the lower 48 states, it's made tougher by all the infrastructure we've put in, whether it's cities or highways or railroad tracks.
Definitely, and that's kind of one of the big differences between the lower 48 states and Alaska, is that in the lower 48, I think of places like Wyoming and Colorado, where they're spending $5-6 million on an overpass to try and restore that connectivity, where in Alaska and in northern Alaska especially, that connectivity exists, and we're looking at proposals for development. And so we have an opportunity to be proactive and identify where those migration corridors are and put in mitigation measures before the impacts arrive.
We're talking today with Kyle Joly, a National Park Service wildlife biologist who recently published a paper on the topic of terrestrial animal migrations. And we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. Dry Tortugas National Park, 70 miles from Key West, just very well might be the most remote national park in the lower 48. But when you arrive, you're surrounded by crystalline waters for snorkeling, kayaking, and relaxing on pristine beaches. There are sunken wrecks to explore, coral reefs swarming with colorful marine life, and history in the brick walls of a Civil War-era fort. The Yankee Freedom 3, departing from Key West, can get you there in a little more than 2 hours. Visit them at drytortugas.com. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to deepen the public's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It's an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org.
So, Kyle, in your paper, I believe you pointed out that caribou and reindeer have the longest terrestrial migrations in the world.
Yeah, most people don't know this, but caribou and reindeer are actually the same species. Caribou are found in North America, and reindeer are found in Europe and Asia. But they're the same species, and they can interbreed freely. But yeah, that species, both caribou and reindeer, had the longest terrestrial migrations on the planet, with a number of populations migrating 1,200 to 1,350 kilometers in a year.
Wow. And what drives the length of those migrations?
Primarily, it's driven by seasonality. So a lot of the animals will migrate in a generally north direction to have their calves, and the calving is timed with a flush of new nutritious growth. Oftentimes, it's tussock tundra, Areophorum is the genus. It's a grass species that has a lot of protein, which is very important for females who are nursing newborn calves.
So are these migrations stretching out, if you will, because of climate change? Any ideas on that?
No, I would think we're seeing a little bit of the opposite. We're seeing one herd that I study the most is the Western Arctic herd, and that's in northwest Alaska. It's the largest caribou herd in the country and one of the largest in the continent and on the planet. That herd, the last couple of years, has actually seen less and less animals migrate. And we're not exactly sure why that is, but one hypothesis is that the animals are benefiting from a longer growing season due to climate change, and so they actually get in better condition and don't feel the need to migrate as much. And so in a typical year, we probably saw maybe 15% of animals not migrate in the traditional manner south to their wintering grounds. So that was pretty common, about that many, about 15%. 2 years ago, we had about 50% of the animals not migrate, and last year we had 80% of the animals not migrate. So, wow. Quite a bit of change.
Yeah. Now, as you might be aware, there recently was a paper coming out of Yellowstone National Park and how the bison up there kind of control spring migration by their grazing habitats, and they'll migrate a certain distance, and then they'll kind of hunker down in one area and keep the greening up, so to speak. Is that something that you're seeing with the caribou?
So the caribou are so far north that the spring migration actually occurs prior to green up, and so they're oftentimes migrating on snow or just brown ground that hasn't greened up yet. And so migration is pre-green up. They're not surfing a green wave per se of emergent vegetation. They're migrating in anticipation of good forage.
Yeah. Now, ungulates such as caribou and reindeer aren't the only migrational species out there. You've looked at wolves as well, haven't you?
So part of our paper was to figure out which ones were longest. And so one of the things that we did was we looked at existing literature. And so there was one study out of the Northwest Territories that looked at a group of wolves, and they classify them as migratory. And so they would give birth at their dens, and then they would, in the winter, they would chase caribou herds around. And so they classified them as migratory. I think that opens up a lot of questions on how to define migration, but maybe that's a different topic.
Yeah, because I know here in the lower states, it's probably more dispersers than migration with wolves. I know there was that one wolf from the Yellowstone area, I think outside in the Cody area, that showed up on the north rim of the Grand Canyon National Park a few years ago, and that was probably more dispersal than migration.
Yeah, and so that's what you typically see, and the wolves are generally thought of as to be territorial. So they have that den, and then they defend an area around it. So that's kind of the classic view. And then you have typically younger animals that are not fitting in or want to start off on their own, and they can disperse very long distances in any direction away from the den and start up, a new pack and a new territory. But whether or not, in Alaska, we do have packs that den in a certain spot and then follow caribou around. It may be to the southeast, it might be to the southwest, it could be any direction, and then they'll come back to their den. And so most people think of migration as discrete movements from one seasonal area to another seasonal area. And for caribou, generally that's a calving area in what we call spring, but often in the north it's, the first week of June. And then they'll generally trend south and find a place to overwinter, and then they'll come back to their calving area, and that's their migration. If you think of it similarly for wolves, they're at that same den site, and they have even more fidelity than caribou. Caribou calve in a calving grounds, but that specific location can bounce around from year to year. Wolves very often will den in the exact same den site, so they actually can have higher fidelity to their birthing area. And then, the caribou will winter in different areas from year to year, so that's varying. And that's, the wolves, where they're spending their winters, if they're chasing caribou, will depend on where the caribou are. So they have about the same amount of fidelity to their wintering area. So it gets complicated, but there is an argument to make that, some wolves are migratory depending on your definition.
Yeah. Now going back to the Western Arctic caribou herd, you mentioned that there's been a movement, so to speak, to fewer and fewer animals migrating, I believe you said. Is it a risk of losing that migrational behavior, the patterns, the instinctive knowledge that, hey, it's time for us to move to better forage or whatnot?
I think the risk is there. I'm not sure how large it is at this point. The herd itself is located in the most remote portion of North America. It's the furthest, the calving grounds are the furthest that you can get from a road or a village in North America. So it's an incredibly remote area. So I mentioned that 2 years ago, only 50% of the animals migrated. Then last year was 80% didn't migrate. This year we had quite a few migrate, but not as many as 85%, which was kind of the average in a normal year. So, one thing when you study caribou is you'll note that there's just an extreme amount of variation from year to year, what the herd does, but also what individuals do. So at this point, I don't think that we're in danger of losing that migration at this point. But I think, thinking out 20, 30, 40, 50 years, those things need to be seriously considered in the face of climate change, in the face of just a slew of development proposals in the region.
Yeah. Those migrations must be phenomenal to watch. I've seen some still photos of the caribou, whether it's crossing the terrestrial landscape or swimming down a river or crossing a river, and just the vast number of animals traveling together is just has to be incredible to watch.
It is. I'm a very lucky person to have the job that I do and to see what I get to see. One of the places that we work is in Kobuk Valley National Park, and it's been a home of caribou migration for 10,000 years. There's an archaeological site there that's dated hunting of caribou there back that far. And there'll be times, the river's probably a quarter mile wide at that point, and there'll be times where you have several hundred animals on the shore. You'll have caribou nose to tail all the way across the river, and then a couple hundred more piled up on the south bank as they're migrating. So it's definitely a wildlife spectacle that is on par with anything on the globe.
Yeah. Now, your study, of course, focused on terrestrial migrations. Have you looked at all at the migrations that various whale species have made?
I'm just limited to terrestrial mammals. That's what I study. I'm familiar with whale migrations, and they're much longer. Avian migrations are much longer than terrestrial migrations, but that's my field of expertise is terrestrial wildlife.
Yeah. So is there another paper in the works beyond this one?
I try and keep pretty busy. We've got a lot of different papers that we're working on. We're actually hoping to get one out in the next couple of weeks that's looking at the timing of spring migration. And we looked at caribou herds from just west of Hudson Bay all the way out to the Chukchi Sea, which is where the Western Arctic herd resides, all the way out in the farthest northwest corner of North America. And so I think that'll be a really interesting paper. There's a lot of synchronicity between the herds, even though they're separated by thousands of miles. So I think that will be pretty interesting to a lot of people.
Yeah, no, definitely sounds like something to look forward to. We've been talking today with Kyle Joly, a wildlife biologist with the National Park Service, who has recently published a paper on terrestrial species migrations. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us today. It sounds like fascinating work, and wish I could join you on the ground someday. But thanks again for your work, and look forward to your next paper.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being on.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, non-profit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. See their successes at www.gtnpf.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
There is such incredible diversity in the national park system. Landscape parks such as Glacier and Denali National Parks, national seashores and lake shores, historical and cultural parks, and national battlefields and military parks. Trying to take it all in can require a lifetime, but exploring the different settings of the national park system can broaden your understanding of the United States and introduce you to many different and at times surprising settings. Contributing writer Kim OConnell recently left her Arlington, Virginia home behind for a trip to Bayou Country. She headed far south in Louisiana to Jean LaFitte National Historical Park and Preserve and joins us today to regale us with what she found. Thanks for joining us, Kim.
Thanks, Kurt. It's great to be here.
You know, that must have been an incredible transformation for you, going from the Appalachians to Bayou country.
It really was. It was actually my first ever trip to Louisiana and New Orleans. So I, had heard about this storied city and Mardi Gras my whole life, but I still didn't really know what to expect. And it really was just as culturally rich and naturally rich as I expected, and even more so. It was just a really heady experience, and really filled my mind and my eyes with lots of things to think about. It was a really fascinating experience.
It must have been really tough to decide where to go or how many weeks you need to stay there. I mean, you've got the natural settings in the Barataria Preserve. You've got downtown New Orleans with the Jazz Park. You got all the rich foods. I mean, how did you plan your trip?
Well, the first thing I did was head for the French Quarter. I actually had an Airbnb not too far outside the French Quarter. So I thought, well, I've got to start there. I've got to get my coffee and beignets and see what all the fuss is about in downtown New Orleans, and see the wonderful architecture with the the cast iron balcony railings, and just kind of soak that up a bit. But being the national park buff that I am, it wasn't too long before I felt like I had to sort of get out of the city and see what coastal Louisiana had to offer, because knowing, from afar what it had gone through with, Hurricane Katrina, et cetera, and just being kind of that swampy environment, I really had to see it for myself. And of course, we have swamps here in Virginia, but not on the scale of coastal Louisiana. So it was really exciting for me to head down to the swamp and head down to the Barataria Preserve part of LaFitte, which was just really fascinating.
Now, if somebody's staying in downtown New Orleans, the French Quarter, how long does it take to get to the Barataria Preserve?
Yes, it took me about 45 minutes by car, I believe, but it was a fairly easy drive, So New Orleans, as far as I can tell, is not as sprawling a city as what I'm used to in the Mid-Atlantic Northeast region. So you kind of get out of town fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. And then you're kind of on these really flat roads where you really can understand the landscape of southern Louisiana. It's really flat, low country, and it's not too long outside of the city of New Orleans that you're kind of surrounded by lush nature and getting into more of the swampy marshlands, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Now, you mentioned that you do have swamps in Virginia of sorts, but to the best of my knowledge, they don't have any alligators or crocodiles in them, do they?
I don't think so. I mean, there might be some alligators in the Great Dismal Swamp, but I'm not sure about that, at least not to the extent. What I learned being down in New Orleans is there are some 2 million wild alligators living in Louisiana, which is the most of any U.S. state. So, and even kind of having that in my mind that there are alligators down there still did not quite prepare me for encountering one on the trail, which I did.
Yeah, that catch your attention.
It did. I'm used to being afraid of black bears in Shenandoah, and so this was quite a different experience. But the alligator was fairly small by Louisiana standards, I'm told, and was very tame and just kind of hung out on the side of the trail, and I kept moving.
Yeah. Now, Barataria is sort of a natural window into the past, isn't it? I mean, by that I mean this is what most of coastal Louisiana used to look like.
That's absolutely right, and that's a really wonderful way to put it, actually, because what I came to understand being down there, which I didn't really understand, was just how much the leveeing of the Mississippi River has affected the natural resources down there. And this is something that has been done for 100 years to try and control the waterway and protect, property from flooding and all kinds of things. And there are, understandable reasons why that process was started, but it has really altered the hydrology, the natural hydrology of the area. And as a result, it's causing some problems with natural resources. They're losing land down there. It's sinking through a process called subsidence. Of course, with rising sea levels, there's, the landscape's really changing on the edge of Louisiana there with sea level rise. So to be in that preserve is a grasp a sense of what the place used to look like before all that engineering came into place. And it's beautiful.
Is the preserve at risk because of the subsidence?
Well, I think it's at risk to the extent that the whole coast is at risk. The Park Service itself, as far as I can tell, is trying to engage in some efforts to protect the park. And those resources, they have different projects going, such as to elevate the trails through boardwalks to protect the landscape. And there's been a lot of channeling and canal building in the area. And there's some efforts and grant projects afoot to reclaim some of the canal projects to restore a more natural hydrology to the region. So my sense is that the Park Service is a leader down there and trying to protect those swamplands from climate change and other issues. But whether they can kind of keep up with the threat, remains to be seen.
Yeah. Now, of course, Jean Lafitte, the historical park, offers more than a walk through the bayou, doesn't it?
Right. What I found fascinating, to my lack of knowledge about the park before I went there, is I thought it was just kind of one park like you're used to seeing at some other places, but it's actually kind of an umbrella for 6 sites, 6 very different sites, because I think there's just so much to protect and interpret in New Orleans. And this is how the Park Service is handling it down there. So you have the Marshy Preserve there, but then you also have the Chalmette unit, which protects both the National Battlefield, which is where the Battle of New Orleans took place during the War of 1812. And that's a really interesting battlefield site. I'm, again, very used to Civil War battlefields here in Virginia, so it was really interesting to go to a site that interprets the War of 1812. There's a national cemetery there that was also very beautiful and serene. And then there's also a few cultural centers. There's one in the French Quarter, and then there's a few scattered around kind of the greater New Orleans area that are devoted to various aspects of Cajun culture. So there's just a lot going on there that's under the umbrella of Jean Lafitte. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot. How long were you down there?
I was just there for a week, which felt very short. So there's a lot of eating and drinking to be done in New Orleans also. So
I've heard.
Yeah.
Now with Mardi Gras season coming up and whatnot, New Year's Eve, if somebody were to go to New Orleans for just a 3 or 4 day stay and they wanted to get out into the historical park, what would you recommend they do?
Well, I think both the Barataria Preserve and the Chalmette units are very accessible from downtown New Orleans, and you could do each of those in a day. The preserve actually has some really well-defined trails, but you can kind of pick and choose, how much of the trails you want to hike. And what I find particularly interesting about the preserve is that they have a section that's hardwood forest, they have a section that's swamp, and then they have a section that's marsh. And so you get to move in a relatively short space. You get to move from these 3 different natural environments fairly quickly. So you get a great snapshot in a relatively small space of the natural resources in the area. And that's kind of in one direction. And then kind of east, what they call downriver from downtown is where the Chalmette unit is. And both the National Battlefield and the National Cemetery are directly next to each other. So you can see both of those in one trip. So I think they're both quite accessible to do in a weekend, in addition to spending some time down in the French Quarter.
Yeah, it all sounds very fascinating, and I'm definitely jealous. Definitely have to put it onto my to-do list. We've been talking today with contributing writer Kim OConnell, who was able to spend a week in New Orleans and visit Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, and she'll have a story for Traveler readers a little later this month. Thanks so much for giving us a little look into it, Kim.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we'll be discussing the problem of invasive species in the parks. While it's our small team at National Parks Traveler that finds sources, fact-checks information, writes, edits, and photographs the stories you hear and read on The Traveler, it wouldn't be possible without the support of our readers and listeners. We have big plans for 2020, and we need your help to continue making our work possible. I hope you share our belief and passion for independent journalism focused on national parks and protected areas, and hope you will consider a gift to help us broaden that coverage. For The Traveler, This is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcast. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.